What's going on, guys? Today we are going to be taking a look back at one of my favorite YouTube channels, Useful Charts, and we're going to be doing a breakdown discussion video / reaction video of the history and timeline of Egyptian pharaohs. Now, if you guys remember back in 2022, I did a couple videos. I did a reaction video when Elizabeth II died. He released the new British monarch line of succession video. Check that out. We did a reaction video on it. It was pretty fun. But now it's been a minute, and I think we're going to give them a relook, especially because now the Pharaoh Friday series has finally kicked in, and we're going to check out the Egyptian pharaohs line of succession, family tree, whatever you want to call it. So he goes through all 31 dynasties in this video, and this video released about a year ago, but I'm finally doing it now because we have more of a grasp on this channel. Because I do the Pharaoh Friday series. If you haven't already checked out the Pharaoh Friday series, go ahead and do that. Or you can just watch this to get my preference. So I'm kind of going to be filling in the gaps because we're going through about 3,000 years of history here, and it's hard to go through 3,000 years of history in only 40 minutes. So I'm just going to try to fill in the gaps here and there for what I know. Now, I'm not, a professional Egyptologist or anything, but I do consider myself an Egyptian historian. I've studied Egypt for a little bit now, so I know quite a bit about each of these periods in history. Now, before we get started, I'd like to also mention that Useful Charts actually commented on one of my videos. I did a video about the European Royal Family Tree West chart, the old one that he sells. He sells all these as posters, most of them. And he actually commented on one of my videos right after he hit 1 million subscribers. I'm like, congrats on 1 million subscribers. He's like, thanks. And then he commented, he's like, nice chart. So, Useful Charts, if you're watching this right now, I love what you do. Keep doing what you're doing. You're making great content. And he's up to 1.7 million subscribers. So, if you haven't already and you're interested in this kind of thing, genealogy and monarchies, and he also has a bunch of Bible videos. So, if you're interested in biblical history, royal history, or just family trees and genealogy in general, he's got videos on like a Donald Trump family tree, Barack Obama family tree, that kind of thing, like even U.S. presidents. He's got a bunch of cool videos. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, go give him a watch. I'd like to say this before we get started. I like how he included the pyramids over there. That's pretty sweet. All right. So without further ado, let's go, baby. Putting on the headphones because I can't wear this hat while I do the headphones. So that sucks. So sorry, no priest hat right now. I might put it on midway through. We'll have to see.
Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you a
Let me turn off the captions.
set of family trees that taken together are longer
So shout outs to Matt.
than any other set of historical trees that I have ever covered on this channel.
That's true. He puts into perspective how long Egypt lasted. Now, the written history of Egypt is about 3,000 years, which is absolutely insane. Because if you think about countries like the United States, the U.S. has not even been around for 300 years. It's been around for about 250 years, a little less than that. If you want to be precise, 248 years. So, Egypt lasted a long time. 31 dynasties, plus more.
I'm going to be going through the entire history of Egyptian pharaohs, all the way from Dynasty 1 to Dynasty 31. That's almost 3,000 years of history,
Right.
So we've got a lot of ground to cover. I'll be using my Ancient History Family Trees chart, which is available as a poster from our website, usefulcharts.com.
So I'm just taking a look at here. It looks like he's got some Greek stuff. He's got Alexander the Great. He's got the Ptolemaic pharaohs. He's got the early Roman emperors. He's got Chinese emperors on there. And a bunch of stuff. He's got a lot on there. So, pretty cool.
But since that chart only covers dynasties 18
He's
to
also got the Persian kings in there. I see Cyrus the Great right there.
31, I'll also be using this chart, which was made by a fan, and which
So shout outs to that fan, early and middle Bronze Age rulers of Egypt. So this is what we're going to be using.
covers dynasties 1 through 17.
Okay, so I just skipped the sponsor. He did an in-game, he did an in-video sponsorship, so I just skipped it just for the purposes of what we're doing. But yeah, so we're going to get started here with the first dynasty.
Word pharaoh. This word was not actually used to refer to the ruler of Egypt until the 18th dynasty. Prior to this, the more accurate term for a ruler of Egypt would simply be king. Originally, the word pharaoh referred to the entire royal palace, not just one person. Kind of like how nowadays we use the phrase the White House to refer to the US president's entire administration, instead of just the president.
So it's interesting, like he says, Dynasty 18 is the beginning of the New Kingdom era, started by Ahmose I right up here. So I guess Ahmose I was the first pharaoh. But even after the 31st dynasty was done and over with, when it was conquered by Alexander the Great, which we'll get to later, Alexander the Great took over Egypt, and then when he died, the kingdom was given to one of his generals, Ptolemy. So you have the pharaohs for about 300 years who are Greek. You have Greek pharaohs, and they go by the title pharaoh still, even though they're not actually from Egypt originally. Ptolemy's descendants, you go all the way down to Cleopatra in the Ptolemaic line, and then she obviously marries Mark Antony, and then Augustus comes in, or I guess Octavian at the time, comes into the Battle of Actium in 30 BC, and they both commit suicide, and then Rome annexes Egypt. But all of the Ptolemaic Greek pharaohs, Greek rulers of Egypt, went by the pharaohs still. But most historians today, including myself, just consider all rulers of Egypt to be pharaohs, even though they didn't call themselves that.
That said, in this video, I'm going to use the word pharaoh from the very beginning.
Yes.
Because informally, that's the term that we usually use for any ancient ruler of Egypt. And I'm actually going to start with what some Egyptologists call Dynasty 0. This includes a handful of pharaohs that we know ruled before Dynasty 1, such as Eri-Hor and Scorpion. What you see on the left is the
So I'm going to let him say this real
name
quick.
Eri-Hor written in hieroglyphs. This is actually the earliest known writing we have of a person's name in all of world history.
So that's pretty incredible. So Eri-Hor and Scorpion are interesting because you got to think about this. We are going back so far here. The very first pharaoh of Egypt was Narmer, who ruled about 3100 BC. That is 5,000 years ago. And that is just absolutely insane to wrap your mind around. Just to put it in this perspective, people say, the Roman Empire was about 2,000 years ago. So, in time, we are closer to Julius Caesar in time than Caesar was to Narmer. That's saying something. So that just goes to show how old these guys are. So basically, just a little bit of rundown of human history. There were people living in the land that we now call Egypt long before Egypt existed. There were a bunch of different cultures, hunter-gathering societies that for the thousands of years leading up to 3000 BC lived along the Nile and settled there. So written records only go back so far. About 3000 BC is the furthest you're going to get back in any written records. Like you said, Eri-Hor, I believe Eri-Hor lived about in the early 3100s BC is when Eri-Hor lived. He's not the oldest historical figure we know about. I'm actually going to challenge him on that. There was a Mesopotamian leader named Kushim. Yeah, Kushim, who lived in Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia goes back about this time. This is known as like the cradle of civilization. So around this time you get all that stuff. Before Egypt existed, humans were mostly hunter-gatherers. But keep in mind that before we get writing in history, basically all that we can get is archaeology. That's all we can get from. So pretty much everything before this point in human history is mostly educated in scientific guesswork. So these kingdoms, for example, the kingdoms that happened right before Egypt, the first king Narmer, he comes from a kingdom called Naqada. And there were Naqada kingdoms, the couple hundred years leading up to when Egypt existed. You had Naqada the first, Naqada the second, and Naqada the third. I don't know why they were called that, because it makes them sound like people. But Naqada the third was the last one, and it was about 3200 BC. And so before then, you had a bunch of cultures. Egypt was divided into Lower and Upper Egypt. Before that, you had a bunch of hunter-gathering tribes and things, mini civilizations that lived along the Nile. Now, during this time, humans started on Earth about 200,000 years ago. And we were hunter-gathering species. And so thousands of years leading up, we were settled along the Nile, and other places we migrated out. And then so this period is known as the Stone Ages. And the Stone Ages is broken up into two eras. You have the Paleolithic era and the Neolithic era. The Paleolithic era is pretty much caveman times, and that's when we start to learn how to use rocks as weapons and things. And then starting about 10,000 BC, you get the Neolithic era. So these early pharaohs and the ones here from Dynasty 0, like Eri-Hor and Scorpion, both come from the Neolithic era. So this is before real written history even existed, for the most part. So Eri-Hor was the father of another pharaoh named Ka, which also fought during this time. Scorpion fought in what's known as the Scorpion Wars. Right at the end of Nikeda III's existence, the kingdom, Scorpion, and then there was Scorpion I and Scorpion II. I'm not sure which one this is, but that's one of the Scorpions. They fought against the Nikeda to basically destroy their empire and take it over, or destroy their civilization and take it over. So then you get what is known, around the time Narmer comes in, humans learn how to use metals for the first time as a source of tools. And then you get what is known as the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is pretty much where written history starts. And you get a bunch of old civilization kingdoms about 3000 BC. You get Mesopotamia is a big one, Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization, and also ancient China. And then over in South America, you get the Norte-Chico culture. So those are about the cradles of civilization right there. Those are the ones that all emerge about the same time. Now, it wasn't until 1799 where we could actually decipher hieroglyphics. There are a couple civilizations like the Indus Valley civilization, which today their writing system is still yet to be deciphered. And there were definitely civilizations long before and that existed at the same time. It's just these ones, and especially Egypt, were really good at keeping written records. So this is starting around the early Bronze Age.
So that's pretty cool. And the image on the right is the earliest depiction we have of a pharaoh. It's unclear whether his name was actually Scorpion or whether that was just some sort of nickname.
So I believe Scorpion was part of Upper Egypt, and then he fought to take out Nikeda III.
Both of these Dynasty 0 pharaohs ruled from a city in Upper Egypt called Nakada. Now don't be confused.
Yeah, so that's Nikeda that I was talking about. That's the city. So Scorpion took it out.
By the fact that Upper Egypt is located below Lower Egypt. The names are based on the way that the Nile River flows, which is south. So think of it this way. Lower Egypt is downriver, and Upper Egypt is upriver. Prior to Dynasty 1, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt had separate rulers. The ruler of Lower Egypt wore a red crown that looked like this, whereas the ruler of Upper Egypt wore a white crown that looked like this.
So like I said, in pre-dynastic Egypt, going back a couple thousands of years, civilization wasn't as sophisticated as it was today. And in Lower Egypt, you had many different cultures that emerged. In Upper Egypt, you had many different cultures that emerged. Nikeda just became very powerful. And by the time Scorpion comes in and takes him out, it's going to get to the point where one of his descendants or another guy living around this time, Narmer, is going to have a vision to unite both of the lands to create his own united Egypt.
Once Egypt was unified, the pharaohs began wearing a double crown, which was a combination of the two.
So you see, if you watch the Pharaoh Friday series, you would know if you see the Dynasty 1 episode, Narmer's played in it, and you see that this red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt are used. I have like a bag, like a paper bag that I use for the Upper Egypt crown, and since Narmer was originally king of Upper Egypt, he goes into Lower Egypt, takes out my sister who's playing as the king of Lower Egypt, wearing those headband, the red headband, and then for the crowning ceremony, the coronation, they're wearing both.
Which brings me to Narmer. Narmer was the first pharaoh to rule both Lower and Upper Egypt. He was likely a member of the same dynasty as Eri-Hor and Scorpion, but he managed to conquer Lower Egypt and thus unite Egypt for the first time. This is why he's considered to be the first pharaoh of the first dynasty. You can see him depicted here wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, and then again here wearing the crown of Lower Egypt.
So this is a very informative document that we found from back in the day. This is a depiction of Narmer smiting somebody because he was seeing all of these pharaohs. They really cared a lot about the afterlife, and the gods shaped their culture. And these pharaohs claimed descent from the gods, and that's kind of how they got their power. So this is the palette of Narmer, and it's very important because it shows him wearing both crowns.
Now, you might have also heard of a pharaoh named Menes, who later sources credit with being the one to unite Egypt. Well, take note that nowadays, most Egyptologists think that Menes was simply another name for Narmer. We don't actually know much about Dynasty 1, but we do know the names of each pharaoh, thanks to various king lists made later.
So a lot of this stuff, and the whole reason we have the dynastic divisions, comes from a historian named Manetho. He was Greek. He lived about, I think he was born in the 100s BC. So he lived during the Ptolemaic era of Egypt, so way late in its history, about 3,000 years later than Narmer. So he kind of pieced together all of the pharaohs and put them in separate dynasties. So that's how you get the 31 dynasties. And that is why like the Ptolemaic era is not considered to be one of the dynasties, because he was living during that time and he considered dynasty 31 to be the last dynasty. So he's the one who so Manetho is the one to place all these pharaohs into dynasties, and we've just been using it ever since. And some of the ways that he changed the dynasties was just kind of random. He pretty much just did what he felt like, and so that's just kind of what we have.
Such as this one, located at the Temple of Seti I.
Believe that's the Abydos king list.
On the list represent those from Dynasty 1. The assumption is that these were all father-son successions, but we don't actually know for sure. So just keep in mind that a lot of these family trees, especially the oldest ones, involve quite a bit of guesswork.
And since a lot of these pharaohs, this is the only reason we know like next to nothing about a lot of pharaohs, because most pharaohs, especially of the early dynastic period, they're just names written down on rocks. That's all we know about them. We know they existed, and that's about it.
Even the dates are estimates and could vary as much as 100 years on either side. Note that this chart highlights Queen Mernith, the wife of Pharaoh Jet. She's the first queen mentioned in the book When Women Ruled the World, because she is the earliest known example of a queen regent. Basically, Jet died when their son Den was still a child, and therefore Mernith ruled until which time Den was old enough to take over the throne.
So that's pretty revolutionary that in the early Bronze Age, you have a queen ruling in her own right. Now, like you said, it's very depending on if she was just a regent or if she actually ruled in her own right, but that's pretty incredible that she's mentioned on the Abydos king list in the Turin canon as being her own thing. Now, Narmer establishes the capital of Memphis, and then his son Hor-Aha really solidifies the religion. Hor-Aha was obsessed with the afterlife, and he was actually pretty crazy. I'm just going to give you a little bit of facts about Hor-Aha you probably don't know. He was so obsessed with the afterlife and his slaves. He had hundreds of slaves. When he died, he had hundreds of his slaves executed so they could serve him in the afterlife. So I'm just speculating here. I don't know if this is true, but if Egyptian religion was true, and that in the afterlife you have eternal living, that means those slaves today are still serving him. That's just pretty insane. But by the time you get to Dynasty 2, they pretty much do away with sacrificing. But a lot of these old pharaohs did sacrifice.
Note also that both Jet and Mernith were the children of Pharaoh Jer. This means that they were both husband and wife and brother and sister. a practice that was actually common for Egyptian pharaohs, all the way to the time of Cleopatra.
That's what you got to do, because that's one way you keep the wealth in the family. You just marry your sister.
So yeah.
It's gross, but yeah.
If you thought the Habsburgs were gross, well, they ain't got nothing on these guys. One other thing we know about Dynasty 1 is that they practiced human sacrifice
like I mentioned,
upon the death of a pharaoh. They believed that the pharaoh would need help in the afterlife. So when a pharaoh died, they killed some of his servants and soldiers and buried them alongside him so that he wouldn't be alone. For example...
Well, Hor-Aha's case, it wasn't just so they wouldn't be alone. He needed people to serve him.
In Pharaoh Jer's tomb, archaeologists found over 500 other bodies, some of whom appeared to have been strangled. Fortunately, this practice was abandoned during Dynasty 2, when real humans were replaced by mini figurines called ushabti. We actually know even less about
So a lot of these pharaohs here at the end, Enedjib, Samarkand, and Quaa, they're pretty much just a couple names on rocks. We don't know a whole lot about them. Den is considered to be the greatest of the first dynasty because he led a lot of military campaigns and things like that. But a lot of the first dynasty we just don't know too much about. And then these guys here, there's theories that the way we get to the second dynasty comes from a succession crisis after Quaa died. And I'm going to see if he gets into that.
Dynasty 2 than we do about Dynasty 1. It is even unclear exactly how many pharaohs there were and how they were related to each other, which is why there's no lines.
Okay, I don't think he's going to go into it. So there's a succession crisis. This is the reason we get Dynasty 2. Now, this is even before the Old Kingdom. These pharaohs didn't even build themselves in pyramids. They buried themselves in pyramids. They buried themselves in underground crypts with like elevated rectangle-shaped burial called a mastaba. And Quaa, after he died about 2910 BC, as you see here, there was a sort of a succession crisis because I guess he had like three sons, Sneferka and Horus Bird, as well as Hotep Sekemwe. And there was supposedly, this has all just been pretty much come up with by archaeologists is one of the reasons. This isn't concrete or anything, but there is factors to back it up. There was like a civil war between these three individuals, and Hotep Sekemwe ended up taking over after Quaa died. But a lot of people think that he might have just usurped the throne from Quaa entirely. It's not really known how Hotep Sekemwe got the throne, but because of the dynastic division here, something abrupt had to have occurred in 2910 BC. But that's kind of weird because these guys were 2900 and then he's putting here as 2890. So again, these dates are just estimates. And this is some of the gods over here. So you have Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Horus. Horus was the god of kings. So the first couple dynasty pharaohs worshipped Horus. That's why you see the bird on a lot of these hieroglyphs.
We do about Dynasty 1. It is even unclear exactly how many pharaohs there were.
Dynasty 2 is
how
murky.
They were related to each other.
Dynasty 2 is murky.
Is why there's no lines shown in this section.
So Nenetjer, I believe, was the first pharaoh to create a statue of himself, and he was the first pharaoh to celebrate a Set festival. Basically, what a Set festival was once a pharaoh reached, I believe it was 30 years on the throne, they would have a Set festival, and then I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 years from there, they would have another one every couple of years to celebrate their long reign. And I'm pretty sure Nenetjer was the first to experience that. Or maybe it was one of these, might have been Set Peribsen. I believe it was Nenetjer who established that tradition. Nebra is also known as Raneb. We don't really know much about him. Set Peribsen. Yeah, these guys just don't know a whole lot about Sekemhib, Sinej, except for Kasekemwe, who I'm sure he'll get into here soon.
However, things change when we come to the final ruler of Dynasty 2, Pharaoh Kasekemi. Large building projects...
I think there's a typo there. It should be Kasekemwe, not Kasekemi, but that's fine.
...started during his reign, and he is the first known pharaoh to commission statues of himself.
Okay, so I was wrong. Nenetjer, that was a later depiction. So Kasekemwe was the first to commission a statue. And Netjer started the festival, though.
Started during his reign, and he is the first known pharaoh to commission statues of himself. He was perhaps the father of the next pharaoh, Djoser, who is notable for many reasons.
So before he gets into this, Kasa Kimwe might have been, there's a little bit of a dispute on some of these documents that say Djoser was not the first pharaoh of the third dynasty, but I think that he was, and most people today do think that he was. So Djoser really kicked some stuff off for Egypt.
Not only is Djoser considered the founder of a new dynasty, Dynasty 3, he's also considered the founder of the Old Kingdom. Basically, in the history of ancient Egypt, there were 3 periods during which Egypt was exceptionally strong and prosperous. These are called the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Whereas the center of royal power during Dynasties 1 and 2 was mostly based in Upper Egypt, by the time the Old Kingdom began, it had been moved to Lower Egypt.
So when a lot of people think of Egypt, we think of like King Tut and Ramses. They all existed during the New Kingdom, and a lot of the pyramids and iconic structures were built during the Old Kingdom.
It was there that Djoser built the very first Egyptian pyramid, known as the Step Pyramid.
It's built just outside of Memphis in the necropolis of the city of Saqqara. And like I said, you take a look at the structure. Basically, this little platform here, this bottom, the reason it was a step pyramid, this is what a mastaba looked like, just this little piece. And so they decided to stack mastabas on top of each other to give Djoser a grand tomb. And Djoser was worshipped as an amazing pharaoh pretty much for the rest of history in Egypt, because he started the Old Kingdom entirely. And the Old Kingdom was marked with its pyramid building.
It's less than half the height of the Great Pyramid of Giza, but still ranks number 10 on the list of the tallest surviving pyramids in Egypt.
So not only is Djoser's pyramid remarkable in that it was the first pyramid, it is actually the oldest stone structure standing in the world today. Djoser died in the 2600s BC, so this structure is well over 4,500 years old. It's the oldest stone structure with a concrete date in the world today.
The architect of this pyramid was a high priest named Imhotep, who was also a physician.
So Imhotep appears in my video, the Dynasty 3 Pharaoh Friday series, played by Casual Gamer. Imhotep was very revolutionary, and he was the guy who designed the step pyramid himself, because Djoser knew he wanted a grand tomb. And Imhotep actually stuck around for a while. I believe he actually commissioned the pyramid of Djoser's son, although there's some debate over that, but I think he lived quite a bit longer after Djoser did die. But he was his chief vizier, as well as a physician and chief architect and a high priest as well. So he was a very prominent figure in Egyptian politics and just Egyptian society as a whole.
He was later deified and worshipped as a god, but don't get him confused with the main bad guy character from the 1999 movie The Mummy. That Imhotep is based on a fictional character from the much later 19th dynasty. Anyhow, the rest of the pharaohs in Dynasty 3 are once again difficult to place on a tree.
So I believe Djoser was succeeded by Sekhemkhet, and I'm pretty sure one of these guys is in a mastaba. It's either Kaaba or Sanakht, but I'm pretty sure Sekhemkhet's burial was still commissioned by Imhotep.
Although the last one...
And I just want to put this here. Djoser did not save Egypt by finding the sacred ketchup. Just saying. I know we wish that was the case, but it wasn't.
He may have been the father of the first pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, Sneferu.
So, Huni was actually being built in the pyramid. I think he shows it here. The pyramid was not actually finished during Huni's lifetime, or it was originally a step pyramid, but by the time Sneferu comes around in the 4th dynasty, the pharaohs really start kicking in gear with the pyramid building. The quote-unquote real pyramids are built during their reign. Now, that's just a quote-unquote thing that historians like to say, not to say that I'm not saying the third dynasty, they weren't real pyramids, but what we think of as pyramids today come from the fourth dynasty. And Huni's pyramid, I think, was actually finished or renovated by Sneferu, his son, because of Huni's premature death.
It was during the fourth dynasty that the Old Kingdom reached its peak, and it was this dynasty that built the most famous pyramids. Sneferu built at least three: the Red Pyramid and Bent Pyramid at Dashur, and the Collapsed Pyramid at Meidum.
So Meidum, he said Meidum. The Meidum Pyramid, I believe, is where Huni is buried. His father is buried here. And they think this was originally supposed to be a step pyramid, but Sneferu made some renovations on it. And I think it was started during the reign of Huni, last pharaoh, third dynasty. But the Bent Pyramid was built, and I'm pretty sure that Sneferu is buried in the Red Pyramid. It's red because it's made out of limestone.
But it was his son, Khufu, who built the most
That's why it's red.
famous pyramid of all, the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Now, I watched this earlier, and I want to make it clear, I'm sorry, Matt, but this is not the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is actually Khafre's pyramid. Now, the way that Giza looks, this pyramid looks to be the tallest. It's Khafre's pyramid. It's his son. Khufu's son was Khafre.
Which, for about 4,000 years, held the record for the tallest human structure ever built.
So, Khafre's pyramid actually sits higher up on the plateau, which makes it appear taller. But the Great Pyramid of Giza, where Khufu's buried, is actually the real Great Pyramid of Giza. And the reason I know this is Khafre's is because Khafre's has this little, encrypted section here that wasn't originally there, obviously, when they built it. But the Great Pyramid does not have that. So this is Khafre's pyramid. But it appears to be the tallest when you take a picture. But it's just slightly shorter than Khufu's because he wanted to make sure that his pyramid wasn't taller than his father's, because he wanted his father to stick in history as the tallest pyramid builder, which 4,000 years stood as the tallest building in the world. 4,000 years, and it's the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing today. That's pretty remarkable.
It, like most other Egyptian pyramids, was built to serve as a tomb for the pharaoh. The next tallest pyramid, also located at Giza, was built by his son Khafre. But what most people don't know is that Khafre was actually preceded by his older brother Djedefre, and that Djedefre built a pyramid too, although he built his 8 kilometers north of Giza. Djedefre's pyramid is known as the Lost Pyramid because while it is known to have been completed, it was at some point completely destroyed, and all that remains of it today is this. Originally, it, as well as all the other pyramids in Egypt, would have looked something like this. However, for whatever reason, Djedefre died and was replaced by his brother Khafre, who decided to build his pyramid right next to that of his father Khufu. But he didn't stop there. Khafre also built the famous Sphinx statue next to his pyramid.
See, that is Khafre's pyramid. That's the one he just showed, so there you go. So they think the Sphinx was probably Khafre.
Now, there are all sorts of theories out there about how the Sphinx may actually have been...
And no, Napoleon did not shoot off his nose.
...built much, much earlier. But these are all dismissed by serious scholars, who virtually all agree that it was built by Khafre. The third and smallest pyramid at Giza was built by Khafre's son, Menkaure, who was the next pharaoh.
So what's interesting is we think of Giza as being like the place of burial for all pharaohs, but really there are only about 3 pharaohs buried there. I don't even think Djedefre was originally supposed to be buried there. Just Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Menkaure is the smallest pyramid there because Khufu and Khafre, when they were ruling Egypt, and probably Djedefre too, had Djedefre's reign not been so short, he probably would have been able, because he was only pharaoh for 5 years, his pyramid would have been absolutely huge. And then by the time you get to Menkaure's reign, Egypt's economy starts to shrink because they lose resources. Khufu and Khafre and Sneferu were really good at capturing other territories in Nubia and the Kingdom of the Punt and over in the Sinai Peninsula, took expeditions all the way up to Lebanon. They took livestock, minerals such as turquoise, gold, all this stuff in stone so they could build these structures. And by the time Menkaure comes to the throne, they start to lose that, and the pyramids are starting to get smaller.
He, in turn, was followed by his son, Shepseskaf, who, for some unknown reason, did not build himself a pyramid, but rather a much smaller tomb instead.
So he opted for a mastaba, because I don't think Shepseskaf, for some reason, he didn't like the whole grand tomb idea, which was interesting. Or it's possible that he just didn't have the resources. No one really knows why Shepseskaf did that, but interesting decision.
Maybe the economy was getting weaker, or the power of the dynasty was declining, because it was after his death that we get a new dynasty, Dynasty 5.
Now, the reason Dynasty 5 comes up is because by the time Shepseskaf dies, there's no sons. He has no sons when he dies. So I guess his sister's husband, Userkaf, ends up taking the throne.
The first pharaoh of that dynasty, Userkaf, was perhaps married to one of Shepseskaf's sisters. But keep in mind that this, like many parts of these trees, is speculative. The 5th dynasty pharaohs built pyramids as well, but theirs were much smaller than those from the 4th dynasty. The most important pharaoh of this dynasty was Userkaf's son, Sahure. His mortuary temple included over 100,000 square feet of stone carvings, like this one, and its architectural style was copied by other pharaohs for many centuries. It was also during his reign that Egypt's navy really started to venture far and wide, from what we now call Lebanon in the north to what we now call Eritrea in the south.
So it's cool that he brings that up, and if you're watching this video when it comes out, the newest episode of Pharaoh Friday that I've made so far is the 5th dynasty. And I had a bunch of different actors for that, so go check it out. That video was worked hard on. You see, he mentioned the mortuary temple, and the mortuary temple was a tradition that was started by Userkaf and proceeded all the way through the 5th dynasty. If you see these names here, Neferefre, Neferirkare, Sahure, Menkaure, Khafre, Jedefre, you hear how they all end in Re, right? Re was the Egyptian word for Ra, which Ra was the sun god. And I mentioned earlier that all of these pharaohs had the divine right to rule. The story goes that Ra is the creator of the Nile. He's the creator of the world as we know it. And these pharaohs claim descent from him. And the cult of Ra was very powerful during the 5th dynasty. And these mortuary temples were built as place of worship for Ra. And that is why all of these pharaohs have the Re name. And one of the theories why Shepseskaf didn't build a pyramid is because he was not a fan of Ra. And unlike his predecessors, didn't build a pyramid. But Userkaf continued the tradition, and he was actually buried in Saqqara. And then the last pharaoh, Unas, he was buried right by Djoser. So Djoser was very admired by most of these Dynasty 5 pharaohs, and the cult of Ra was probably the most powerful it had ever been.
He was followed by his son, Neferirkare, who built the largest pyramid of the 5th dynasty, slightly larger than the smallest pyramid at Giza. He, in turn, was followed by his son, Neferefra.
And a lot of these Dynasty 5 pharaohs were not buried in Giza. Userkaf did away with that tradition. I don't really know why. I guess because they didn't have the resources and they knew that they were probably going to be forgotten and overshadowed by Khufu and Khafre's pyramids, so they decided to change their burial place to Abu Sir. And I'm pretty sure Sahure was the first pharaoh to change it to Abu Sir. Userkaf was buried at Saqqara, and so was a couple of these other ones like Unas, which was the last pharaoh of 5th dynasty.
Though a brother may have ruled briefly in between. Neferefra holds the distinction of being the earliest pharaoh for whom bodily remains have been found. As you probably know, the ancient Egyptians are well known for having preserved the bodies of important people in the form of mummies. Due to grave robberies, very few mummies from before the New Kingdom have survived, and in fact we have only partial remains of 2 pharaohs. One of those is Neferefre, and the other is his grandson, Djedkare Isesi. Djedkare Isesi was followed by his son, Unas, who is notable because in his tomb were found the earliest examples of pyramid texts. These were religious spells that were meant to help guide the pharaoh's spirit out of the tomb and into the afterlife.
Like I said, his pyramid was built right by Djoser's, and so it was much smaller, obviously, because he didn't have the resources. And by the time Unas gets on the throne, the economy in Egypt is just getting weaker and weaker. There is a succession crisis because Unas has no sons. His daughter Iput marries a guy named Teti, who then becomes the pharaoh. But then Teti's successor, he's the first pharaoh of the 6th dynasty. He had a previous marriage. That son becomes king first, and then his other son, Pepi the first.
Unas did not have any heirs, so at this point the throne passed to his son-in-law, Teti, and thus a new dynasty was born. During the 6th dynasty, the politics in ancient Egypt experienced a major shift, with court officials, local administrators, and religious leaders gaining more power. Especially important were the nomarchs, the hereditary rulers of each nome or province.
Yeah, so this was pretty bad. The 6th dynasty was the last dynasty of the Old Kingdom, put it in perspective. So by the time you get to the later pharaohs like Pepi II, and especially his sons, most of the country's at civil war with the nomarchs.
But something else occurred during the 6th dynasty that might explain why the Old Kingdom came to such an abrupt end at this point. It was the event that most scholars now call the 4.2 kiloyear event, because it occurred approximately 4,200 years ago. This major climate event caused dry conditions worldwide, which resulted not only in the fall of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, but also the fall of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley Civilization in South Asia. Interestingly, the pharaoh who ruled just prior to this event was Pepi II, who is said to have reigned for a record 94 years.
Yeah.
This is almost certainly an exaggeration, though, as most scholars estimate that the length of his reign was closer to 64 years. Still, that's pretty good for an early Bronze Age ruler.
So put that into perspective. With all biased stuff in mind, with the records and stuff, if that were to be true for 94-year reign, that would make Pepi II the longest reigning pharaoh in Egyptian history. But not only that, it would make him the longest reigning monarch, period, in human history. The longest reigning monarch ever, Pepi II would be.
The next 4 dynasties make up what's called the First Intermediate Period, a sort of dark ages between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. We know next to nothing about these dynasties.
Yeah, the First Intermediate Period is rough.
And in fact, the 7th dynasty might not have even existed at all. According to the Ptolemaic
Well, it existed, but
historian Manetho, the 7th dynasty consisted of 70 rulers in 70 days, which was probably just a poetic way of saying that things got really, really bad. The 8th, 9th, and 10th dynasties were all very minor and were limited to Lower Egypt.
So they all only lasted a few decades. 8th dynasty was in Memphis, only lasted 20 years, and a lot of these existed simultaneously. This one existed, Dynasty 9 for 30 years, Dynasty 10 for about 90 years, but Dynasty 10 and Dynasty 11 existed at the same time. Dynasty 11 actually, I guess, came first, and then the early pharaohs of Dynasty 11 are nomarchs. They start out as, and they actually reign during the First Intermediate Period. It's not till Mentuhotep II who founds the Middle Kingdom in, I guess, like 2050 BC.
In contrast, the 11th...
So basically, what happens here during these 4 dynasties, Egypt is at war with the nomarchs, and they can't take back their remaining territory, and they just rule over small chunks of the empire, while as elsewhere, nomarchs are ruling.
The 11th dynasty was based in Upper Egypt and started out as a rival to the 10th dynasty. In fact, its first 5 rulers should not...
So nomarchs are pretty much what Egyptians called, like, for outsiders. So in the Roman Empire, famously, they called any non-Romans barbarians. Basically, barbarians to Egyptians were nomarchs.
Not really be considered pharaohs, but rather nomarchs. But that all changed with Mentuhotep II.
So you get Intef the Elder, who was the first one there.
He managed to defeat Lower Egypt and unite the country once again. This marks the start of the Middle Kingdom.
So he's actually considered to be the second Menes, or the second Narmer. He was pretty much seen as the savior of Egypt because he brought everything back. He reunited the previous heights of the old kingdom that Egypt had been regressing from for the last 100 years up to this point.
When once again power was centralized in the hands of the pharaoh. Mentuhotep II was followed by his son Mentuhotep III, and then by his son Mentuhotep IV, before power then shifted to a new dynasty, Dynasty 12. The 12th dynasty began with Pharaoh Amenemhat I, who had previously been the vizier or prime minister under Mentuhotep IV. Whether he took control because Mentuhotep IV did not have any sons, or whether he usurped the throne, is unknown. But what we do know is that he and his descendants helped the Middle Kingdom to reach new heights. For the first time ever, Egypt had a standing army, and they used it to expand their borders into Nubia to the south. They also built a canal parallel to the Nile that connected the Nile River to Lake Moeris, thus creating what is today known as the Fayum Oasis.
So going back to what I said at the beginning of the video, there were a lot of civilizations created along the area of the Fayum Oasis, and the 12th dynasty created that sort of river canal system, one of the first in history where you actually have a human-built canal connecting two bodies of water for transportation. It was very good for trade and commerce.
And they revived the practice of building pyramids as tombs, although their pyramids weren't quite as big as the Old Kingdom ones, and most of them have since fallen apart.
Yeah.
One example of this is the Black Pyramid of Amenemhat III. The most important pharaoh of this dynasty, however, was Senusret III. He is thought to be the pharaoh upon which the later Greek legend of Sesostris was built. According to the Greeks, this pharaoh led an army all the way up to Anatolia and then crossed over into
Anatolia is like modern-day Turkey.
Europe, reaching as far as what is today Bulgaria. Tales of his exploits were so famous that Alexander the Great was initially called the New Sesostris. That said, it is extremely unlikely that Senusret or any other ancient pharaoh ever did reach Europe. However, we do have evidence that he campaigned in the land of Canaan, about 500 years before the arrival of the Israelites.
And what's interesting too is before them, Senusret I, Amenemhat II, they really start the push to conquer Nubia, which Nubia had been a long-time rival of the Old Kingdom pharaohs, and a lot of cities were sacked on both sides of the spectrum. And Senusret I and Amenemhat II have the vision to basically conquer it all. And it takes just a couple more dynasties, and by the time a new kingdom comes around in late of the Second Intermediate period, Nubia is pretty much entirely conquered by Egypt.
Senusret III was followed by his son, Amenemhat III, who, unlike his father, was not militaristic and simply ruled peacefully during the height of the Middle Kingdom's power. Amenemhat III was followed by his son, Amenemhat IV, but apparently Amenemhat IV died without heirs, so the throne went to his sister wife, Sobekneferu, who became the first ever female pharaoh to reign in her own right.
If you don't count Mernith, but she was technically what we think a regent for her son.
She's the second of the 6 queens discussed in the book When Women Ruled the World. However, her reign lasted less than 4 years, and thus, with her, the 12th dynasty came to an end.
So that's interesting. He says that Amenemhat IV had no sons, but this line, I don't know if this is actually true. It's written as though Sobek-hotep I, the first pharaoh of Dynasty 13, was the son of Amenemhat IV, so that's kind of confusing. Maybe it was another case where he was too young to rule or something. But it's also really weird that there were more pharaohs of the 13th dynasty, but only Sobek-hotep I is considered to be part of the Middle Kingdom.
The next pharaoh was Sobek-hotep I. And while he might have been a son of Amenemhat IV, his reign is seen as being the beginning of a new dynasty and the end of the Middle Kingdom. At this point, Egypt entered its second intermediate period and fell into at least two parts. While the 13th dynasty continued to rule in Upper Egypt, a rival 14th dynasty eventually took over Lower Egypt, although not much is known about them since, as I mentioned earlier, these intermediate periods were kind of the equivalent of Dark Ages. The 15th dynasty, however, is very important. This was the dynasty of the Hyksos, the first foreign dynasty to rule Egypt, although take note that they were restricted to Lower Egypt. The Hyksos were basically Canaanites from what would later be known as the land of Israel, and thus there has always been a lot of speculation about how they might relate to the stories told in the Bible. Some have suggested that the story of Joseph matches well with the time period of the Hyksos, because Joseph, who originally lived in the land of Canaan, ended up becoming the second command in Egypt. This would make more sense if Egypt was being ruled by fellow Canaanites. In Upper Egypt, the 13th dynasty was...
So you get most of these dynasties, again, they happened a lot simultaneously. So you have traditional Egyptians as pharaohs ruling in Dynasty 16 in Thebes, and there's just like small little chunks. You had some nomarchs, you had the Hyksos, like you said, and the Hyksos, both 15 and 16th dynasties are happening at the same time. So the Hyksos take over Lower Egypt, and then the traditional African pharaohs continue to rule just in Thebes, and then in the 17 and 1600s BC, you get Avaris in Lower Egypt before Dynasty 14 is conquered by the Hyksos. And then, I guess, Rahotep comes in, and I don't know if he conquers the stuff, because this is still part of the second intermediate period still. So, but Egypt starts to kind of build itself up again.
Was eventually replaced by the 16th dynasty, and then by the 17th dynasty. Let's start with Pharaoh Tau, also known as Sekenenra. There's an ancient Egyptian story called the Quarrel of Apophis and Sekenenra. Apophis was the last major ruler of the Hyksos dynasty. In the story, he sends a letter to Sekenenre in Thebes, complaining about a pool of hippopotamuses that Sekenenre has. Apophis claims that he can hear the noisy hippopotamuses all the way down where he lives, and that they are preventing him from sleeping. While obviously not a real story, this may symbolize the growing conflict between Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt at this point, because when Teo's son Kamos took over, he went to war against Apophis. However, he died before he could defeat him.
So what's really interesting here is you have three brothers all named Intef. You have Intef the 5th, 6th, and 7th. And Intef the 5th and 6th rule at the same time. And then 5 years later you get Intef the 7th, and 5 years later you get Ahmose.
And therefore the task was taken over by his brother, who founded the next dynasty. It's at this point that we can now switch to our ancient history family trees chart, which starts with Ahmose I of the 18th dynasty, who was actually the son of the second to last pharaoh of the 17th dynasty.
So now we fully know the regnal dates. So this is actually a chart now made by Matt. So you have some Moses over here, Moses tree, family tree. So that's interesting.
However, since he defeated the Hyksos and reunited Egypt, his reign marks the beginning of a new dynasty, as well as the beginning of the new kingdom. Of the three ancient Egyptian kingdoms, the new kingdom was the largest and most powerful, and therefore it is also sometimes called the Egyptian Empire. Ahmose I was followed by his son, Amenhotep I, and then by Thutmose I, who was probably his son-in-law.
So we definitely know most about the New Kingdom pharaohs of any of the other periods, and they're the most famous.
Being the husband of his daughter Ahmose. However, I need to remind you that even at this point, there are still a lot of question marks when it comes to these family trees. Sometimes a link shown on this chart between two people is just one possibility among many. So just keep that in mind going forward.
Yeah, and this is still so long ago. This is still about 1,500 years before Christ. So it's we're still really far back there. We're still in the Bronze Age. We're not even to the Iron Age yet.
Anyhow, Thutmose I was followed by his son Thutmose II. But then we get one of the most famous female pharaohs of all time. When Thutmose II dies before his son, Thutmose III is ready to take the throne. What happens is that his half-sister, Hatshepsut, who was also one of his wives, took over and ruled until Thutmose III came of age. And unlike her sickly brother, who didn't accomplish much, Hatshepsut took Egypt to new heights. However, when she died and Thutmose III finally took over, he proceeded to try and erase any memory of her. This, of course, didn't work, though, because we know today that Hatshepsut truly was one of the most influential pharaohs of this dynasty.
Yeah, very interesting. There were not too many female pharaohs in Egyptian history, but Hatshepsut is one of the most famous. And she was not the mother of Thutmose III. She was the I guess, stepmother type deal. So he didn't really like her, and I think she pretty much started out as a regent for Thutmose III, and then she started to get really, really powerful. And a lot of people liked her a lot, but Thutmose did not. Thutmose III was pretty remarkable himself, though, so I'm sure we'll get into that.
But Thutmose III accomplished a lot too, especially militarily.
So I wonder who this Neferure guy is, because Thutmose II and Hatshepsut had a child together. Huh.
He's been called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, which is a bit silly because it's probably better to say that Napoleon was the Thutmose III of modern Europe. He campaigned up as far as Syria and was one of the few pharaohs to cross the Euphrates River, which means that he's not actually a very good candidate for being the pharaoh of the Exodus, even though, according to some literal interpretations of the Bible, the Exodus would have occurred during his reign.
So in one of the stories in the Bible, you have the Exodus story, which mentions the Pharaoh who has led a bunch of conquests around the lands in the Bible, like in those Middle Eastern areas. And there's a lot of discussion that the Pharaoh was probably one of two people. It was either Thutmose III or Ramses II. A lot of people think it was Ramses because although the time period doesn't line up as well, the areas in where he invaded lines up better because Thutmose III was in the Euphrates River, which was far away from the land of Canaan and Israel and things like that, where all these stuff was probably taking place.
The reason why this doesn't...
Now, Moses, on the other hand, we don't actually know if was a real 100% figure or if he's a work of literature. But he lived around the same time as these pharaohs because they speculate that Moses lived around the same time as Thutmose III. That's why a lot of people think that literally Thutmose III was the pharaoh in the Exodus.
Makes sense is that Egypt controlled pretty much all of Canaan at this time. So if the Israelites did leave Lower Egypt during the reign of Thutmose III, they would have simply ended up in a different part of the Egyptian Empire once they reached Canaan. I'll return to this topic in a bit, but first, let's continue down the tree. Thutmose III was followed by Amenhotep II, who made peace with the kingdom of Mitanni, which at the time was the main power to the north of the Egyptian Empire. He was then followed by Thutmose IV, who is known for restoring the Sphinx and for commissioning the Dream Stele, which is located between the paws of the Sphinx. Next came Amenhotep III, also known as Amenhotep the Great, who presided over the apex of ancient Egyptian art and culture.
What's interesting is, I just read an article this morning, they just found some information about Amenhotep III that was in some body of water, like they just uncovered it the other day, so that's kind of interesting. He might have something new to report on Amenhotep III. Was actually on the throne for quite a while, 30 plus years.
He was followed by his controversial son Akhenaten.
Which all these pharaohs did live, like the average lifespan for an Egyptian person was probably 35, 40 years old. Akhenaten, though, this guy is something else.
Originally known as Amenhotep IV, who decided to change the state religion so that only one god, Aten, was worshipped.
So that's why he changed. So the first couple of years of his reign, he changes his name to Akhenaten because he changes the religion. Because Egypt had mostly been polytheistic. Akhenaten is one of the first people, just in world history in general, to propose monotheism. But it wasn't exactly monotheism because Akhenaten kind of acknowledged the existence of the other gods, but he wanted to make Aten the main god. So it's kind of like a little bit of a weird ordeal.
This was not monotheism per se, but rather henotheism, which is the worship of only one god while acknowledging the existence of others. The timing of this religious experiment in Egypt is interesting, because just a few centuries later, the idea of worshiping only one god would pop up again in the nearby kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Whether or not there is a direct link is unknown, but it's certainly interesting to think about, considering that the Israelite religion went on to birth Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
So for those reasons, Akhenaten was considered to be like the most controversial pharaoh of all time.
Akhenaten is also important because of his connection to the Amarna letters, one of the most important archaeological finds when it comes to the history of ancient Egypt. Discovered in 1887, the Amarna letters consist of hundreds of clay tablets that record diplomatic correspondence between mostly Akhenaten and various rulers of Mesopotamian states. These letters have greatly assisted historians and linguists in understanding the culture and language of this time period. The decades following Akhenaten's reign are a bit difficult to understand, as there were two short reigning pharaohs whose identities are debated. The first of these is Smenkhare, who may have been the husband of Akhenaten's daughter Meritaten, or perhaps Meritaten herself. Then there was Nefer-Neferu Aten, who may have been the same person as Smenkhare, or may have been somebody totally different. One popular theory is that Nefer-Neferu Aten was actually Nefertiti, the wife of Akhenaten, perhaps pretending to be a man.
So what's really interesting is Meritaten and Nefertiti might have assumed different identities so they could take the throne. So this is one of the... So she assumed to be a man by the name of Nefer-Neferu Aten, so she could succeed either her daughter or that son-in-law. Really just speculative case. And the fact that this was in the 1300s BC is just real tough to really decipher if that was real or not. But Nefertiti was the wife of Akhenaten. This very famous sculpture of her is right here.
Whoever Nefer-Neferu Aten was, he or she was followed by one of the most well-known pharaohs of all time, Tutankhamun, or King Tut. He was actually a rather unimportant pharaoh, as pharaohs go.
And he was the son of Akhenaten with his sister. And that's part of the reason why he was so unhealthy.
And is only famous because his tomb was one of the very few pharaonic tombs to be discovered almost entirely intact.
And the pharaoh you see above me is Tutankhamun because he's probably the most well-known pharaoh, either him or Ramses. But I'd say King Tut's the most popular pharaoh. And he really didn't do much of anything because he ruled from ages 9 to 18.
Unfortunately for archaeologists, most tombs and other sites in Egypt have been robbed many times over the millennia. So finding one that is mostly intact is next to impossible.
Yeah.
But in the 1920s...
That's probably why King Tut's was not robbed, is because he was not an important pharaoh. And just imagine, because how much gold was in King Tut's tomb, how much gold would be in somebody's tomb, like Ramses or Djoser or something like that, who actually was very, very famous.
Archaeologists found this door with an unbroken seal leading to a room that hadn't been entered for over 3,000 years. Inside, they found artwork like this, and rooms full of ancient objects like this.
That's crazy. Imagine being an archaeologist and going in there and you find this stuff. That's just crazy, dude. You find 4,000 or 3,000-year-old dog carving things in a chest and all this stuff. That's just amazing to me.
But perhaps most importantly, they found this box. which inside had this box, which inside had this
Look how
box,
intricate
which
that is.
inside had this box, which inside had this final box, which inside had a mummy wearing this famous mask. Lots of studies have been done on King Tut's remains, and one thing we know for sure is that he was very unhealthy, probably due to all the inbreeding. We also now know, thanks to advances in DNA research, that King Tut's mother was not Nefertiti, but rather a woman previously labeled as the Younger Lady. And we also know that his mother and father were full siblings. Due to his poor health, King Tut only lived to be 19, and following his death, it appears that Nefertiti's father, who was also Akhenaten's uncle, took over for a few years. He was then followed by...
So, Nefertiti was actually, I guess... So, Amenhotep III was married to this woman who her brother was Ai. So, his uncle by marriage was Ai. So, I guess Nefertiti was kind of like... I'm trying to think how it's related. So, his mother's... So, that was his first cousin. So, Nefertiti was Akhenaten's first cousin. So, he married his first cousin. And then another relative named Horemheb comes in. And Horemheb tries to erase Akhenaten from history because he does not like him. But Akhenaten's way more well known today than Horemheb. So good try.
By Nefertiti's brother-in-law, Horemheb. One of the most important things Horemheb did was start to erase all evidence of Akhenaten's deviant religion. By this point, Egypt had reverted to its usual polytheism. So anyone who continued to support the worship of only one god was considered a heretic. Dynasty 18 had run out of possible heirs. So,
because Akhenaten, I think he was only like 35 when he died, so he wasn't able to really solidify that. And he didn't really have a lot of followers.
When Horemheb died, his former vizier took over and became Ramses I, thus establishing a new dynasty, Dynasty 19. Ramses himself did not reign long, but as soon as his son Seti I took power, the new dynasty really started to take off.
So a lot of these old king lists that you find, like the Abydos king list and things like that, a lot of them were created by Seti I. That's where you get a lot of the old kingdom information started to be documented for the first time under Seti I. Still over 1,000 years before Manetho existed. So that's why we don't really know much about these old dynasties, because by this point, they're so distant, even by the New Kingdom standards.
Seti I would probably have been remembered as one of the greatest pharaohs ever, if it had not been for the fact that his son Ramses II was even greater, which is why he's called Ramses the Great. Part of the reason for that is that he lived for a really long time, probably more than 90 years, resulting in a reign of 66 years. During this time, he fought against the Hittites, led by King Hattusili III, but eventually the two powers negotiated a peace treaty, which involved Ramses marrying Hattusili's daughter, Mathorneferu. He had previously been married to a woman named Nefertari, who he obviously respected quite a bit, because for the first and only time in Egyptian history, the pharaoh built a statue of her that was the same size as his own. But I don't mean to give the impression that Ramses was humble, because he was not. He built lots of massive statues of himself, including these ones of him sitting, located in Nubia.
Rest in peace, this statue.
Then there was this one, now broken, the head now displayed at the British Museum. It's the statue that Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote the poem Ozymandias about, Ozymandias being the Greek name for Ramses. According to most scholars, Ramses the Great was probably also the inspiration for the character of Pharaoh in the Bible's Exodus story. The context for that story fits much better with the reign of Ramses than it does with the earlier mentioned Thutmose III. Not that I'm saying that the Exodus story should be taken literally. I don't think that it should be. But it is likely that the story does contain a kernel of a historical memory, and that memory probably has something to do with the Israelites being subjugated sometime during the 18th and 19th dynasties. In fact, we have written evidence that Ramses' son and heir, Merneptah, at least claimed to have subjugated the Israelites. He says so in the Merneptah stele, which contains the earliest known mention of the people of Israel outside of the Bible. But the archaeological record also shows that after this point, Egypt lost control of Canaan, which allowed the Israelites to flourish, indicating that this sequence of events around this time might be what the Exodus story is really all about. After Merneptah, 2 of his sons fought for the throne, with Seti II emerging as the victor. But when Seti II died, and then his heir...
So you actually get some pharaohs in between here. Just a bunch of minor rulers.
Siptah died. One of Merneptah's daughters, named Tuosret, ended up on the throne. However, this led to another civil war, which ended with a relative named Setnakte on the throne.
So this line's kind of interesting. Just some relative of some sort of Ramses. Senakte.
Setnakte was either a grandson of Ramses the Great via another line, or perhaps a lower-ranking son of Merneptah. Either way, his ascension marks the beginning of a new dynasty, Dynasty 20, during which time Setnakte's son, Ramses III, became the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. This is because it was during his reign that one of the most important events in ancient history occurred, the Bronze Age collapse. For some reason, all of the major civilizations along the eastern Mediterranean Sea, such as the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Hittites, all rapidly declined at the exact same time, resulting in what's been called the Greek Dark Ages.
Ooh.
One of the reasons for this decline, or perhaps one of the results, was the emergence of the Sea Peoples. Ramses III was suddenly forced to defend Egypt against a massive attack from the sea. He managed to repel the attack, but in the decades that followed, Egypt got weaker and weaker.
So the Sea Peoples are interesting because no one really knows anything about them. We only know about them because of texts from kingdoms that they invaded. We don't know their origin. We don't really know who was a part of that. We just know people from the sea kind of invaded, kind of like the Vikings did in England way later on and up in the Scandinavian regions 2,000 years later. But no one really knows a lot about the Sea Peoples. We just know about them because the Egyptians talked about them.
This was not helped by the fact
Also, this guy's headless.
massive attack from the sea. He managed to repel the attack, but in the decades that followed, Egypt got weaker and weaker.
Pretty much civil war broke out.
This was not helped by the fact that after his death, 4 different branches of the family fought for power. After Ramses III came a Ramses IV, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Ramses II was so popular that every single pharaoh of the 20th dynasty decided to be named Ramses.
With the death of Ramses XI, Egypt
And I think they changed their name when they became pharaoh because I don't think he would have had 3 sons named Ramses.
again effectively split in 2, ushering in the 3rd intermediate period.
Ouch.
Yet another Dark Ages. This time, Lower Egypt continued to be ruled by pharaohs, Dynasty 21. But Upper Egypt was, for the first time, ruled by priests, the high priests of Amun. Note that both Smendes I, the founder of the 21st dynasty, and Penedjem I, the high priest of Amun, married daughters of Ramses XI.
Okay.
This period of disunity ended with the rise of yet another foreign dynasty, this time from Libya. Originally, they had held the title Great Chiefs of Ma, but eventually Shawshank I, who had served as Egypt's top general, became pharaoh, ushering in the 22nd dynasty. He named one of his sons as high priest of Amun, thus bringing both Upper and Lower Egypt under his control. Shawshank I also holds the distinction of being the first pharaoh to be mentioned by name in the Bible. This is because it is at this point in the biblical story that the narrative moves from legendary material to more historical material. So basically, it was the 22nd dynasty of Egypt that overlapped with the kingdoms of Israel and Judah.
So you have David over here, see, famous king of Judah, back in Avid. So the house of Avid back during this time, 900 BC. Although David's existence as a historical figure today is debated by scholars.
As well as the rise of the Assyrian Empire. If you want to learn more about the various pharaohs mentioned by name in the Bible, you can check out our video on that topic, which I'll link to in the description.
So I'm going to say not just Shawshank is not just the first pharaoh listed in the Bible, but he's the first historical figure. We have concrete archaeological existence and evidence of their existence in the entire Bible. Out of all the characters in the Bible, Shishak, or Shawshank the First, is the oldest person that we actually know existed. 943 to 922 BC was when he reigned.
The unification ushered in by Shawshank I lasted only about 100 years. Eventually, his tree split in two directions.
So after this part of Egypt, it all gets bad for everybody.
With one part controlling Upper Egypt as Dynasty 23.
Because now you get what's part of the Egyptian late period and not so much the third intermediate period. And this is not part of a kingdom because it's just the slow decline of the Egyptian Empire.
And the other part continuing to rule Lower Egypt as Dynasty 22. The situation became even more complicated when a third dynasty, called Dynasty 24, started to rule as well. However, Dynasties 22, 23, and 24 all came to an end when Pa, the king of Kush, also known as Nubia, came north and managed to defeat them all. He founded the 25th dynasty, during which time Egypt was simply a part of the much larger Kushite Empire. This is why the pharaohs of the 25th dynasty are sometimes called the Black Pharaohs, indicating that they were probably darker skinned. However, this feeds the idea that all the other pharaohs of Egypt were white, which they most likely were not. But I'm not saying that they were black either. The fact of the matter is that the concept of race, as we understand it today, didn't exist then. And the best that we can determine from DNA studies is that most pharaohs were not too different from Middle Eastern people today, who are quite varied in their appearance. Here's how various Egyptians were depicted during the Roman era. This should give you an idea of what some of the pharaohs probably looked like too.
Egypt is pretty much Middle East anyway, so I would consider that to be very likely.
Powerful of the Kushite pharaohs was Taharka, who is mentioned in the Bible under the name Tirhaka. During his reign, Egypt experienced a bit of a renaissance and managed to hold off the growing Assyrian Empire for several decades. But eventually the Assyrians got a foothold in Egypt, and in 664 BCE...
So this is where you get the time where Egypt's not even really ruled by Egyptians anymore. It's other people. You have Nubians, and now you have Assyrians taking over, and then you're going to have Greeks take over.
They placed a puppet pharaoh named Psamtik I on the throne, establishing Dynasty 26. Dynasty 26 marks the shift from the third intermediate period to what's called the Egyptian late period.
So here's where you get the late period.
At the start of this period, Assyria experienced a rapid decline, and therefore Psamtik I went from being a puppet ruler to being an independent ruler. He was followed by his son Necho II, who, among other things, is remembered for having killed King Josiah of Judah. However, the greatest pharaoh of this dynasty was Ahmose II, who actually may not have been a male line of Psamtik I. His exact connection to the tree is unknown, but at the very least he was married to one of the daughters of the previous pharaoh, Apries. Ahmose II is often considered to have been the last great native pharaoh, because after his death, Egypt fell to the Achaemenid.
I mean, you could argue that he wasn't even native because he was Assyrian, but more native than what we're going to get over here.
Persians. The Achaemenid Empire was established by Cyrus the Great, but Cyrus himself never managed to conquer Egypt. This task was left to his son, Cambyses II. Cambyses became pharaoh in 525 BCE, and this marks the beginning of the 27th dynasty of Egypt, which consisted of whoever was king of kings of the Achaemenid Empire. So in addition to Cambyses II, this dynasty also included Darius the Great, Xerxes the Great, and Artaxerxes I. However, during the reign of Artaxerxes' son, Darius II, Egypt managed to revolt and achieve independence under a pharaoh named Amarteus, who may have been a descendant of the 26th dynasty.
Shortest lived dynasty, 5 years, the entire dynasty. Well, actually, that's probably not the shortest living. But only one guy made up the 28th dynasty. I think the 7th dynasty was actually shorter.
However, his reign is considered to be the 28th dynasty, even though it wasn't actually a dynasty at all, since he was the only member of it. His reign was followed by...
You get Dynasty 29, it was just 2 people, and then Dynasty 30 was 3 people.
The reign of another general, Nephtheritis I, and his son Hakoras, who together make up Dynasty 29. Then we get another general taking over, named Nectanebo I. He and his son Teos and his grandson Nectanebo II make up Dynasty 30, which was the last native dynasty of Egypt, because in 342 BCE, Egypt was once again conquered by Persia. Under the reign of Artaxerxes, Egypt was once again conquered by Persia. Under the reign of Artaxerxes III. Artaxerxes III, Artaxerxes IV, and Darius III make up Dynasty 31, the last of the numbered dynasties of Egypt, because after this, Egypt was conquered by Alexander the Great. Note that he and his initial heirs are not considered Dynasty 32.
Alexander Macedon.
Of course, soon after Alexander the Great.
And the reason they're not considered Dynasty 32 is because the Ptolemaic pharaohs were actually ruling at the time the dynasties were created. So Manetho actually ruled during this Ptolemaic era.
Egypt came to be ruled by the Ptolemies, the descendants of Ptolemy I, who had been one of Alexander's generals. I'm not going to go through the Ptolemaic dynasty because we've already done a video on them.
But they did consider themselves to be pharaohs,
which I'll simply link to in the description.
So they lasted about 300 years.
But I'll go ahead and tell you how the story ends, because you likely already know. The Ptolemaic dynasty eventually leads to the famous female pharaoh named Cleopatra, who...
Cleopatra VII. Technically the last pharaoh of Egypt. Well, actually, I guess it was Caesarion down here. But she's kind of ruled at the same time. They both get killed by Augustus, the Battle of Actium.
Was lovers with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony.
So she ends up... So Julius Caesar and Mark Antony are ruling at different times. So Mark Antony, while he's married to Cleopatra, is ruling in what's part of the second triumvirate, which was a portion of 3 rulers between him, Lepidus, and also Octavian. Which Octavian was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. And Mark Antony is also related to Octavian's sister, Octavia here. But Julius Caesar has a son with Cleopatra, Caesarion, who kind of becomes co-pharaoh with her. But she's previously married to Ptolemy the 13th and Ptolemy the 14th. So by the time Ptolemy the 14th dies, Caesarion becomes pharaoh. So I guess there's kind of dual monarchs because because she's Cleopatra the 7th, so all the other Cleopatras were co-pharaohs. But she was married to... She had relationships, at least, with Ptolemy the 13th, Ptolemy the 14th, Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony. And then also, I guess, yeah, that's quite the resume there.
Following her death, Egypt became part of the Roman Empire.
And
while the Roman emperors did technically hold the title of pharaoh, this practice was eventually abandoned following the reign of Maximinus Daza in 313 CE.
That's interesting.
And was never resurrected.
So he was technically the last pharaoh, but... So I guess even Tiberius, Claudius, Caligula, Nero, all of these old pharaohs, or all these old emperors of Rome, consider themselves to be pharaoh as well. That's interesting. So here's Cleopatra the 8th right here. So they had a daughter with Mark Antony. So this was during the second triumvirate, but then after Cleopatra and and Mark Antony both commit suicide together, and Caesarion's killed. Augustus is crowned 3 years later as the first emperor of Rome.
So that was a look at some of the family trees of Egyptian pharaohs, all the way from Dynasty 1 to Dynasty 31. If you like getting a bunch of knowledge in a short...
Alright guys, so that's going to conclude this video. I did a video like this about a year ago, just going through all the pharaohs, but now we know a little bit more knowledge. Go check out the Pharaoh Friday series because we have a lot more ground to cover, like series, and it's probably going to be going on for a while. So if you want to see the upcoming videos, we have one more video to post within the Old Kingdom. If you don't know what Pharaoh Friday is, it's like kind of like live action reenactment. So if you're into that, go check it out, and I'll leave a link to Dynasty 5 on the end screen. So go check those out and go give useful charts a watch if you like this content. If you're still watching, you probably like it, so, or at least somewhat interested, so that's pretty interesting. So, wow, interesting. This is just interesting. Stay tuned for some more Egyptian content. And I'm going to get back with some more original content next week. Just need something because I've been very busy lately. So with that all said and done, be sure to comment, like, subscribe. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. Wah!